to show you, this is not the original. Actually, I think Faustino's had the original. And this, I put my glasses on, see? You can see, this is Steve DeFranza did this logo. And this logo, it's amazing, it's gone through many transformations. Actually, New England Classical Singers now uses part of this logo also. And I believe in our archives we have a photo of Steve presenting this logo. And I don't know, is somebody here? Could you tell us anything about this photo? This is Mary Christina.
This is me, and this is my daughter, who was 12 at the time, and is now 51.
Dick Graber, who I don't think he is alive anymore either. He is the one that's in the photo with Sigrid over there, with Sigrid Perkins. And so we have this photo, and this tells who did what. But what is interesting to me is that it was 2 nights. The first night, we had a performance, and we then had dancing with Bill Daggett. Anybody remember Bill Daggett? Remember? Yeah, who was Bill Daggett? She was. Oh, Buffy, why don't you say?
Oh, he was the middle school music teacher, band director for
Yes, he
years
was.
and years.
It's actually the reason that I'm in North Reading, because I was going to move someplace else. I you know, Thomas Wolfe, you can't go home again. I was not going to go home again. But he told me actually that there were other towns that I was thinking of moving in the area that had not so good opioid problems, even there, drug problems, even then. And this was 72. So he convinced me to come back to North Reading, which I am eternally grateful for. So thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you. So Bill Daggett, and on the Saturday we have a traditional buffet. I don't know if anybody remembers Annette Morelli. She was a restaurateur, and she served us a buffet. Now I want you to see how exorbitantly costly this was. Can you see?
Four down.
Can you see?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Those were the days.
Those were the days, my friend. Can you see that?
Yeah.
It's $2 for seniors, and then $4 per person, and that included the dance and the supper dance.
Oh my.
So that was that. So you are dealing with
Say that
programs.
for the newspaper today.
Yeah,
3 years at that point.
the programs that this was the original one. I did find this one. And UPS printed up some more for us, thank goodness. And unfortunately, you can see it's been a series of little events. And Dan Tremblay tried very hard to get the microphone going for over an hour and couldn't. So we are going to have to speak up. Bob, you didn't want to.
No, they went here. I was speaking very low.
Like,
Or,
we never can hear you. Never, no.
no, so you didn't want to. So, you did not have, you brought in a photo shoot. Where are you? Yes, there she is. You brought in the thing that I'll present to have.
The logo.
The logo, yeah. So I thought, couldn't find it. All right, so if you have read anything about Bob Rustino, as I said, alias Frederick Rice, Dr. Bob, he has quite an extensive background. And I'd like to introduce him now. This is Dr. Bob Rustino. I know, his wife is shuddering.
That's not what I call them at home.
That's right.
Yeah.
And
Second fetch is my name.
and so he said he likes to walk around. He is an educator. He is, I can't even go into all of the things.
You don't have to.
He was professor at many, many different schools. He still goes every summer to Poland. I can never say the name of that city correctly.
Woods.
Łódź, but it's spelled L-O-D-Z.
Z.
But it's Łódź.
But that's Poland.
But that's Poland. And so how many years have you been going there, Bob?
Oh, I've been going there about 12 years now.
And they keep asking him back. It's amazing. It's amazing. And he's still doing voluntary, he lives outside of Belfast now, and he's still doing all kinds of volunteer work. So thank you, Dr. Bob. Please, the
Well,
floor is yours.
thank you very much.
I'll take you.
Whoa. I didn't tell you to stop. All right. I'm going to be very informal about this. I want you folks to be able to, at any time, if you want to stop me to ask questions. I got some notes here, just to remind me, because as you get older, of course, your memory sort of fades. And she was remarking about that poster. Half a century ago we did this. Half a century ago.
Not quite.
Huh? What's 78? Yeah. I mean, you think about it, half a century. It is a frightening thought. But that's how long ago it was.
Almost married that long, right?
It's been very longer than that.
Beth Thompson was with us, of course, Nancy and so forth. And when I was talking with Beth, we were talking about this just a few minutes ago, about this production. And I often say this to my wife and others who I talk to on occasion, that doing Grassroots was one of the most memorable experiences of my life. Because it's one of those rare times when we were in a community in which all these people came together from different backgrounds with all kinds of tremendous talent, whether they were choreographers, directors, whether they were musicians, whether they were performers, they actors, or just people who wanted to help. We created this unique production that not only was well received by the audiences who attended Grassroots, but remarkably, I think today you could put this on and people would enjoy it, because it was so unique and so well done. And we can all take, I still take pleasure in the fact that I can look back on that and say that was one of the great experiences of my life. And I think it also paid real homage to the community of North Reading in talking about one of their native sons. Now I want to ask you, do you know much about George Frederick Root? Any of you know anything about him? I don't want to, I will just kind of review a little bit, but if I get too pedantic or too boring, and I see your eyes going half-mast, I'll just cut off and I'll go to the exciting stuff. Because he had a wild sex life that I'm going to talk about this evening. I woke her up. She was going, this is going to be boring. Oh. I didn't know about it. So, George was born in 1820 in Sheffield, Mass. His mother, Sarah Flint Root, came from North Reading, was born here in North Reading in 1797. And as a matter of fact, she was descended from John Flint. That Flint is a very common name, especially in English. But John Flint came to New England in 1640 with a group of Puritans. And so he established the Flint family here. And so he was born in Sheffield because Sarah was visiting her sister in Sheffield, Mass, and met Frederick Root. And as things turned out, she married him. And a few years, well, about a year later, the little one came along, George Frederick Root. Now, originally, she wanted the name of Frederick Handel Root after Frederick Handel, but the father didn't like him having the same name, so they changed it to George Frederick Root. And so he was born there, and they were there for about 7 years, and then what happened was that her father, his father rather, Frederick's father had given them a place to live, but Frederick's father went bankrupt, so they lost the home. And so her grandfather, back here in North Reading, offered them the Pratt place, right here in this town. Now, Pratt was a farmer who also had a tannery, but the tannery went out of business, and so this, so her grandfather bought the place and offered it to them as a home, and that's where they settled in. And so George spent his formative years here until about he was about 18 years of age. And about halfway through that period, his father left for, guess where? Buenos Aires, Argentina, to try to make his fortune in Argentina. He wanted to become a professional dancer there. but he didn't do too well. Anyway, and he stayed there for a few years while George took care of the family, basically by running the Pratt place, which became known as the Willow Farm. Now, does anybody know, does the Willow Farm, anybody know where that is here in town? Is that town? Well, that's where they live, the Willow Farm.
The Eisenhower Farm.
The Eisenhower Farm.
Okay.
Now, George didn't have any formal education in terms of music. Really, he learned a lot of it by instructions with others, and he became a competent flautist and decided when he was 18 that he wanted to go to Boston. Actually, he ended up in Boston quite by accident. He was out there in Worcester, Mass, and he was there to visit some music sheet stores and some musical instrument stores, and then taking the train back. Unfortunately, it stopped in Boston, and there were difficulties getting the next train back home, and so he stayed in Boston for a while. I liked it so much he decided he was going to go to Boston to try to establish a musical career. Now, what we don't realize is that you have Railroad Street or Railroad Ave here.
Yes,
We lived in Hull. After we moved from here, we lived in a number of places. One of them was Holliston. And Holliston has the same thing. They have a place where there's an old train station. The trestles are now a path that you can walk. At one time, all of New England was connected by a train system. You could go anywhere by train, absolutely anywhere. You stepped out of your house, a 5-minute walk or a buggy ride down, get on the train anywhere you wanted to go. A lot faster than you could travel in your car today. Now that train system, of course, was destroyed by the coming of the automobile, but for that period of time, that train system tied the country together. And as a matter of fact, it was very instrumental in the Civil War for transporting troops and so on. As a matter of fact, it was one of the first times that armies were actually moved by train from one location to another, hundreds and sometimes thousands of miles. But you had that train system here, so traveling for them to Boston or going to the South Shore, as a matter of fact, you could take a train from here and you could go all the way to Mount Washington in a matter of a couple of hours. Isn't that nice, huh? Try it by car today. You'll be stuck in traffic on 128 for the rest of your life. So anyway, he goes to Boston, and eventually, in 1839, he starts to do a lot of teaching, and he becomes rather successful at the teaching. And he eventually goes to New York City in 1845, and in New York City, he collaborates with a woman by the name of Fanny Crosby and a number of other people, and he starts to write a lot of popular songs. Now, this man wrote some real dingers. Now, we're going to give it a this is hot stuff. One of his big hits was Hazel Dell. Yeah, you know that one, huh? But if you don't know that, you remember Rosalie the Prairie Flower. All right, let me know.
That remembers.
Now, this is deep stuff. So I'm going to give you some of the lyrics to Hazel Dell. For the young women in the audience, close your ears because this may be too much for you. In the hazel dell, my lily's sleeping. Nellie loved so long, and lonely lovely, which I'm keeping, Nellie lost in God. I mean, does that bring a tear to your eye? This would send you to the local tavern to drink. Now listen to Rosalie the Prairie Flower. This is a winner. All right? We all set? Hold on to yourselves. On the distant prairie, where we, the heather wild, in its quiet beauty lived and smiled, stands a little cottage and a creepy vine, loves around its porch to twine. This was the kind of stuff he wrote, and it was wildly successful. They loved this stuff. He sold hundreds of thousands of sheets of music. Now imagine this. Today, if he were a writer, he would probably be selling millions of records. And the people just ate this stuff up. This was the sentimental age, from about 1840 right to the Civil War. People loved this kind of music. And of course, they didn't have the gramophone at this time. The gramophone was about 20 or 30 years in the future. But what they did have is a piano, and so they would buy sheet music. Like, you would go to a store and buy a record. Remember those 45s? We'd go and look for the 45s. Well, they went to the store and they bought sheet music, and he sold hundreds of thousands of copies. So he was very, very popular, very, very famous, and very, very successful as a songwriter, with a lot of collaborators, including Fanny Crosby. Now, and during this time, in 1852, he meets a number of people, a gentleman by the name of Dodsworth, and also Mason. What's Mason's first name? Lee? Lowell Mason. And they get involved in establishing the Dodsworth Music Hall. And from the Dodsworth Music Hall, they established the Normal Musical Institute, which was an institute for training music teachers. And eventually he would move this to North Reading. It gets known as the North Reading Institute. And the North Reading Institute becomes very, very famous across the country as a place for educating would-be musicians, musicologists, as well as teachers. And during this period, he also writes 2 cantatas, The Haymakers and The Flower Queen. Now, Bentha was saying that she had heard a recording of The Haymakers, and she said it was god-awful, and it probably was, but it was a tremendously successful here and in Europe. Tremendously successful. This guy made a career out of writing stuff that today we would listen to. A lot of the stuff we would listen to, we would say, my God, how did he make a living? But he was very, very successful because he knew his audience of that time. He knew what to write for them. Because while he was doing all of this, he also made a very good living writing hymns. He's very well known as a writer of hymns. If you go online and look him up, you'll see many of the references to him are as a hymnal writer. And he has literally scores of hymns that he wrote. Yes?
I just noticed last Sunday on the Congregational Church that every Sunday for the children's service, Jesus loved the little children. And he wrote that,
He wrote
and I
that.
never realized that.
Yeah.
Different words.
He wrote tremendous number of hymns. So he's very, very, very successful. Then, of course, he moves in 1859 to Chicago. He does so because his brother and a gentleman by the name of Cady, C-A-D-Y, have established a firm that publishes sheet music. And he goes to Chicago with his family to run that business. And then the war breaks out, of course, in 1861. Now, his family, because of their rich background, beginning with the Puritans and whatnot, he was brought up in a household that really prized patriotism, love of country, love of flag. And so he was really, at the age of 40, he was kind of old, long in the tooth to sign up to fight the war. But he had a lot of patriotism. He had a real fervor for protecting the Union. And he wrote, as a matter of fact, he wrote the first Civil War song, but then he would write many others. And they would become extraordinarily famous. Can anyone name a song from the Civil War they think is, aside from the Battle Hymn of the Republic, that they think is famous?
Oh, the Tramp, Tramp.
Yeah, very famous. He wrote Tramp, 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 the Boys Are Marching. The one that was the most famous, though, sung by, what was that? No, the Make a Cheer he wrote too, but that was famous, but not quite as famous as this one.
Rally round the
The
flag.
battle cry of freedom, rally around the flag. How's it go? Freedom, hooray for the Union, down in the drum. So this was so popular that it sold 750,000 copies. You know what that has? At a population of what? They must have been a population of 60 million people, with only a small portion having pianos, and yet he sold 750,000 copies of this. It was so popular that 2 gentlemen from the Confederacy stole it and rewrote it for the Confederacy. That's how popular it was. And then in 1867, a group of people involved in a social movement in England also took the song and used it to promote their social movement in that country. So it became very popular in England and later in Europe. And incredibly, this was the most famous song of the Civil War. But he not only wrote that, but he wrote a number of other songs. He wrote, all total, he wrote 36 songs during the Civil War. And for the entire course of the war, as a matter of fact, in 1895, when he had died, they published a catalog of national war songs. There were 114 songs in that catalog. 36 were written by George Frederick Root. 36 of them. So about a third of the songs he had written. And he had written, of course, the most famous, Tramp, 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 The Vacant Chair, and The Battle Cry of Freedom. I want my wife just to stand up for a minute. She'll tell you a little story about the vacant chair and how we use that in our production. Come, my dear, with your lame, with the lame wing and all,
Yeah, she's just
and explain the story. Tell the story. Go ahead.
Okay. So we sang this song, The Vacant Chair. And I think we donated our rocking chair, because it was a rocking chair. We had a rocking chair on the stage, and we were rehearsing, and we're singing, and the thing starts rocking. And we're looking at each other like, there's no wind in here, why is this chair rocking? So, started looking behind the curtain, see if anybody, tied something to the chair. No strings are noticeable. And like, wow, that's really amazing. So, the day of the performance, we said, let's make it rock, Let's tie a string, and this time do it. So we were talking about this, and so I said, so did the chair rock? But I couldn't remember. I couldn't remember if on the day of the performance we actually went through with it, but I think we did, because it was so stressful by the time we got to performance day. Because we were right down to the wire there, and although the music was pretty well, we were doing pretty well with the chorus and music, we were still very, very fudgy on the dancing. It was terrifying. The idea that you could be up there and, all these people out there know you, they're your friends, they're your relatives, and you're gonna go and make an absolute idiot out of yourself on the stage. So I was so nervous about the whole thing by the time we got to the day of performance that I can't actually remember for sure if we did make the chair move. But
Anybody remember?
it automatically moved all by itself in rehearsal. So that was something I brought up when we were talking about the
Yes.
doing this thing. Yeah, right. We were like, okay. So that's my empty chair song, my vacant chair.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mary. Come again. So it's in 1895, George passed away, and they had a long obituary of him in the New York Times, and given to the New York Times to write a really succinct headline to the story: Dr. George F. Root dead. I mean, direct, right there, so we knew what happened to George F. Root, but it was a very, very well done piece, even with lyrics from his various songs and his background, so they really honored him. And most recently, well, not most recently, but just a few years before we did Grassroots in 1970, he was inducted into the Songwriters Hall of Fame. So he's there with a lot of other well-known Americans, including people like George Gershwin and Cole Porter and others. And as a matter of fact, for his, yes, ma'am.
I was up in Maine about 10 years ago, and it was out at Land's End, and this Great Island, and so on and so forth. And right past the house, the summer house
Yes.
that he had.
Yeah.
And
That was Bailey's Island. That's where he died.
And
Yeah.
my kids were staying at a home, so I stayed a couple of days at a motel right there. And they had a book for sale about the area. And here's a big picture of the summer house. And it said George Root's summer house and so on and so forth. And so the owner was there, and I said, oh, there's George Root's summer house. And he said, yes, that's our George Root's I said, no, he's not your George Root.
He's our George Root.
I said,
Our George Root.
our George Root.
Yeah,
He said, what do you mean yours? I said, well, he lived across the street from where I live. And he said, what do you mean? So I told him where he lived and where I lived and so forth. He said, no, he lived here, and that we claim him. So we got into a big brawl.
Did you win?
He took me out to walk around where the house was. It was for sale at the time. And then like the next day, the author of the book showed up. And she lives in Chicago.
Oh, Carter.
So, great thing, I met her, and we became friendly, and long story short, a couple of months later, she and her friends all wound up in North Reading to visit the grave and bring flowers.
Yeah, he was, as a matter of fact, he spent time also in Bangor. He lived there, symphony orchestra in Bangor, and did a lot of work up there. So he spent a lot of time in Maine. And I think one of the reasons why Mainers sort of adopted him is because Maine has a very close historical tie with the Civil War. They probably, more so than any other war, associate their heritage with that war. And so he played a prominent part in that war. And that's why, of course, Joshua Chamberlain, the famous Civil War general, who was also the president of Borden College, it came from Maine, and so they have this really kind of collective love of their heritage and their history associated with the Civil War, and because of George's role, they really kind of took him in and adopted him.
Just to add to that, because Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain is one of my all-time heroes, his wife Fanny was from Brunswick at Bowdenville, was very, very musical, and I've read this whole story about I think it's called Joshua and Fanny. She comes down at some point from Brunswick, Maine to North Reading.
It has this is the sex part with George Root.
Yeah,
Fanny and George.
suspended with George Root.
Now the truth comes around with George. Interesting. Go, I'm sorry, sir.
No, Chamberlain's wife Fanny came down to study in North Reading. So I'm reading this whole thing about my hero, Joshua Chamberlain. And his wife.
Isn't it amazing when you look at history, the interconnectedness of people? You know, that old thing about 7 degrees of separation, everyone's attached to everyone else. You look at this and you see all these kinds of wonderful connections. And I didn't mention, but he, back in 1845, he was married to Mary Olive Woodman. She was actually the sister of J.C. Woodman, who he had met in Boston, who was also a musician. But they had 6 kids, 6 children. 2 boys and 5 girls. One of the boys became a music teacher. What was that? What did I say? 2 boys, 22 girls. 2 boys and 4 girls. All the girls were musical, singers and what have you. One of the boys was a music teacher. The other boy just went into business. I don't know what happened to him. So they had a lot of music in the family. And as a matter of fact, his wife, Sarah, was also very musical and sang in local choirs. So that's the background for George. What I want to do is talk a little bit about the script, because that's what I was supposed to talk about, but I thought I got to fill in the holes.
I'm so glad you did, thank you.
Fill in the holes on our guy, Mr. Root. When they were putting Grassroots together, I was trying to recall how I got to write the script. And I got volunteered. Usually what happens to me, I get volunteered by my wife. And I think that's what happened, but I can't really recall. 50 years ago, who can remember? And I was probably drinking at the time, so I really didn't remember anything. So, but I got Wayne over to doing the script, and then I did research, of course, on George. But one of the issues, when you're writing a script, you have to tie it together, because they had a musical they were going to produce. They had a lot of great music and a lot of scenes they were going to do, but you have to tie it together somehow. How was I going to bind this thing together that made sense? Well, one of the things that was, we need a narrator. So the big question was, well, who's going to be the narrator? And it seemed to me it was apparent that the narrator had to be, even though he's deceased, George Root. And so I had to write the George Root character, but in reading from material on George Root, it was hard to get a sense of the man himself, his personality. But I knew one thing you had to do with the narrator, and you had to give him a sense of humor. You had to make him be able to look at himself with a sense of humor, and to give perspective to the time with a sense of humor, in order to carry the audience along. And part of it was to entertain the audience while he was introducing all of these musical numbers that emphasize a certain particular point in the history of not only North Reading, but the country itself, and what was happening in the country. So I'll give you an example, like the introduction. He says, ladies, and oh, by the way, This role was played by Fred Rice, who you'll see pictures of. And Fred did a marvelous job of taking my script and adding to it, and ad-libbing and creating a real character. Because Fred, maybe some of you may know Fred, but Fred was a wonderful sense of theater and a really a great actor, and really took this role and made it what it was. So it begins, ladies and gentlemen, welcome. I wish to present to you a man, this is him talking about himself. I wish to present to you a man whose great musical talents and knowledge are only exceeded by his high moral character and majestic presence. I refer in these vague and general terms to myself, George Frederick Root. And he goes on and on with these kinds of things like, I consider introduction unnecessary, but since it is the custom to have it, I prefer to do the act myself, thus relating all the proper facts. I was born humble, but I managed to outgrow it. Then he goes on in this kind of way. So to kind of give you a sense of the character himself, because his job was to really tie all this together in historical perspective. And so he gives a little bit about his growth and development, and then he introduces the first song, The Horticultural Wife, and then he starts talking about one of his jobs as a teacher at the Spengler Institute in New York City, which we're somewhat fond of calling the Spinster Institute. And he says, why I cannot fathom, since most of the young ladies were quite able to find husbands. Indeed, some had to. But I'm both. Okay, all right. All right. My next act now, I'm going to feel like any young man here. Then he goes on to say, upstate in Seneca Falls, because this is a period, 1848. What's going on in 1848, in that late 40s? Come on, what's going on, ladies? What?
Suffragettes.
Suffragettes. Men, you should know this was the beginning of our downfall. The suffragette movement would destroy our particular role of dominance in society forever. So the suffragette movement is going on. So then he says, upstate in Seneca Falls, Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton called the Convention of Women to draft a feminist Declaration of Independence to effect that all men and women are created equal. Have you ever heard anything so ridiculous? To effect that all men and women are created equal and endowed with certain inalienable rights. I'm thankful to the ladies for setting the record straight, George Root says, and always been under the impression that women were in every respect superior to man. His wife was listening, that's why. What was going on here? Okay. And one who attended that convention was Amelia Jenks Bloomer, who was a temperance reformer, women's rights editor, and suffragette. When she married Dexter Bloomer, the word obey was struck from her marriage vows. Mrs. Bloomer gained national prominence and a place in history with her eloquent defense of the wearing of pantalettes, later popularly known as
Bloomers.
Bloomers. Without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Ms. Bloomer, who is going to give the speech she gave at the suffragette convention.
Amelia.
Bloomer, you're closer.
Okay, thank you. It's a dangerous weapon up here, that microphone. Thank you, Dr. Messina. Men have endeavored in every way that they could to destroy women's confidence in our won powers, to lessen our self-respect, and to make us willing to lead a dependent and abject life. Now, in view of the entire disenfranchisement of one-half the people of this country, their social and religious degradation, in view of the unjust laws above mentioned, and because women do feel themselves aggrieved, oppressed, and fraudulently deprived of their most sacred rights, we insist that women have immediate admission to all the rights and privileges which belong to them as citizens of the United States. Thank you.
So George then stands up and says, "It is my considered opinion that under every skirt, there is a bloomer."
In fact, Amanda stopped wearing bloomers
Yes, she did. I know.
after 3 years.
She went to thongs, but that's another story.
The krillin came in style, and so she wasn't so bound by the previous styles, and she gave up her bloomers and went to krillin.
She went to Finland. How about that? See, we even get involved in lingerie here because she eventually found it, Victoria's Secrets. But that's it. Okay. So this was the period known as the sentimental age. We've already talked about that particular period in which he wrote many of those sentimental songs. Then comes the war, the Civil War years, and in those years, of course, he writes "Tramp, Tramp, Tramp." There was a marching, the battle cry of freedom, and many other songs which became quite famous. And here we have, at this particular point in the Grassroots, we have the song "Tramp, Tramp," which was sung just before the Battle Mother, and then finally the vacant chair. And then comes the end of the war. We enter into the Gilded Age, and in the Gilded Age, of course, this begins in the 70s. Ulysses S. Grant becomes president, but it's also an age of much corruption and scandal. But he continues to be extraordinarily successful. Meanwhile, what we're introducing now is a lot of the music of the period, and a lot of the they had as you can see up here, at one part of the production, they had a fashion show showing you many of the clothing that was worn at that period of time. There was a woman in time. Who was the woman who had? She had a closet full of actually.
Oh, what a closet full.
House full.
House full.
Full period.
This was Arlene Tendine, who was, wait a minute, somebody knows. Do you know?
Oh, I just read it somewhere.
Oh, okay, yes.
I remember the name.
She was actually Hilltop Nursery school teacher. And I believe that Tom Shells had somebody in school there or whatever.
Ann was working there.
Was it
Ann worked
Ann?
there.
Yeah, so maybe you know the story about me when
I only remember going to her house to try on clothes, and there were everything you opened were more period clothing.
It was absolutely incredible. She lived just over the line in Wilmington, and we climbed up this long ladder into the attic, and she kept pulling down all those costumes. Every single one of them were in her attic.
How did she get them?
I have no idea. I was hoping that maybe somebody would
Yes,
know.
Ann knows.
But they gave a real natural flavor to the production because they were real clothing from that period, and it was one of the highlights of the production. And so we go from there to the Gilded Age ends, of course, with the gay 90s and a really difficult period in the United States in which we had a tremendous amount of social upheaval and unrest because of the deep depression the country went into and the whole issue about the gold standard. And so he recounts this. As usual, gaiety could always be found in one quarter of American society, politics. The presidential election of 1896 pitted the Democrat silver-throated orator William Jennings Bryan against William McKinley. It was, as the country boys would say, a humdinger. And in this scene, there's Bryan and Foraker, and Bryan says, now Bryan was a real orator, and he was against the gold standard. And his most famous speech, of course, was titled "Being Crucified on a Cross of Gold." If they dare to come out in the open and defend the gold standard as a good thing, we will fight them to the uttermost. Having behind us the producing masses of this nation in the world, supported by the commercial interest, the laboring interest, and the toilers everywhere. We will answer their demand for a gold standard by saying to them, you shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind on a cross of gold. And so a reporter says to the Congressman Foraker, he's addressing Foraker, he says, Congressman Foraker, as a Republican, do you think Brian deserves the title Boy Orator of the Platte River? And Foraker says, yes, I believe he does, because the Platte River is 6 inches deep and 6 miles wide at the mouth. So Brian lost the election, but it was a gay old time. Politics hasn't changed at all. It's still the same. And so they go into the new century, in which now Judge Root, that is Fred Rice's judge, who's asked to announce to the audience, of course, by this time I'm dead. So you have to now have a willing suspension of disbelief to believe that I'm continuing to narrate this particular part of the production from the grave. And he goes on explaining the tremendous changes that have taken place. Because what happens now is, what is introduced in the late 1800s that have a profound effect on America? The what? Automobile. The automobile comes with the being, and with the automobile eventually roads and highways, and so the rail system dies because of that. But it also, we also see more and more people traveling to see one another with the automobile. And also some other things. During this period is a tremendous period of innovation and technological advancement. We have Thomas Alva Edison, who invents just about everything. I mean, literally. As a matter of fact, if he had lived, he would have invented the internet. And of course, people like other folks who made tremendous contributions, like what's his name now?
Bell?
Bell, yeah, Alexander Graham Bell. Thank you very much, dear. You can see it, I'm too old for this. Alexander Graham Bell, Guglielmo Marconi. The first radio broadcast takes place when? 1895. By the way, when was the electronic age come into being? When did the electronic age of communication come into being? Question. When?
The Second World War?
No? No. Come on, you're all very, very knowledgeable, very experienced. When did the electronic age of communication begin?
With the telephone?
Was it
65. Bell telephone? That's 1875. No. 1844. Why? The telegraph. The telegraph is the first piece of electronic communication because it sends messages at the speed of light, which is the speed of electrons running across the lines. So from that point on, we see tremendous amount of technological advancement, and this is all affecting the way people live, both here in North Reading and around the country. And so the music now is starting to reflect that, the gain of the 90s going into the 20s and beyond. And so the music of Hazel Dell and Rosalie, the Prairie Flower, drift off into the past as we see the music grow more and more advanced. And people like Charles Ives are starting to establish a name for themselves with modern music. And then, of course, Cole Porter's kind of music, and Gershwin and Kern and a host of others bring in this popular age of music beginning in the 20s and the 30s. But they are all standing on the shoulders of one man, George Frederick Root, who probably for his time, as I mentioned earlier, was far more popular than any of them would ever be. And a number of songs during this period that they sang, The Road Not Taken, All the Little Horses, Sure on This Shining Night. And then we have a number of other songs from some of the folks that wrote during this particular period. And finally, we have Charles Ives' famous Son of a Gambler, which sort of ends and concludes the show. Remember the Sons of a Gambler? Can you sing it?
No, I can't.
No, but it was played on the kazoos. And
Yeah,
just found-
we played it on the kazoo.
And I just, we did sing it too.
Well, the tool basically, you will recognize it because it's used by Georgia Tech.
Yeah, it's the
Yeah.
Rambling Wreck from Georgia
Yeah,
Tech.
Rambling Wreck from Georgia Tech, a hell of an engineer. It's the same thing, but it's Gambler instead of engineer. So, That song was co-opted by the folks in Georgia Tech. So that concluded the Grassroots production, and it was just a marvelous piece of community enterprise that we still remember. And our only regret, we only have one regret, is nobody thought of using that recent invention of the videotape.
I know.
The videograph this whole thing, because we don't have a copy of the thing.
We don't even have a recording of it.
We don't even have a good recording of it.
Yes.
And we were trying to present it again, but most of the cast would be in wheelchairs. It's really difficult to go on stage, you know, the chairs are riding around. We can't do it. But it was a fantastic experience. Do any of you have any questions of Dave?
I'd like to make a couple of comments just to appreciate George Root.
Oh, sure, go ahead.
Because he is a fascinating character. His autobiography is in the public library here, if you're ever curious, you can pick it up. But his name was George Frederick, and he was named after George Frederick Handel. And so I don't know where that comes into the family. There's not enough information about that background. His mother was interested in music and was involved with music, but there's no mention of Handel's Messiah or anything like that. So I don't know where that comes from. But you know, he went to Europe in 1850, right?
Yeah, I think what happened was the mother, I think, was familiar with Handel's Messiah, which was very popular at the time, and it was his mother who came up with the idea of naming him after Handel, but the father didn't like the idea of using the Frederick, because his name was Frederick. So the mother evidently had some exposure to that. Because of her, she was a singer.
Yeah, but I don't know, where did you find that?
What?
I couldn't find
I
it.
found that actually in a mayonnaise bottle in front of Pickle Windows.
Did he at some point try to affect Friedrich as his middle name?
Yeah.
I thought I read someplace that he kind of went around calling him George Friedrich.
Well, no, he actually went around calling himself George F. Wurzel for a while. That was his pseudonym. Because Wurzel was German. Yeah.
Friedrich, because he was in Germany, and he wanted to be the American Mendelssohn.
Yeah.
That was his
Okay.
objective. He actually thought of himself as a classical musician. But
Yeah.
that isn't what he was able to accomplish.
No.
Which I think is really interesting
Yeah.
in terms of the character.
Well, that's it, kids. You can all go to sleep now.
One of the most moving things that somebody had told me, it was the reading of the names going into the Civil War song,
Oh, yeah.
Tramp, Tramp, Tramp. And Tom, I didn't know where to find that, and would you tell us where to find it? So
Yes.
people can check?
That's right.
It's right in the plaques, right upstairs.
The plaque's right upstairs in the.
I should
of the library.
let's talk about that, because I didn't put it into the script, but I did develop the list, and I gave it to Fred. And I came up with that because I thought it was a way of really bringing home, because my mother later stopped me after the production. She had seen the first production. She stopped me and said, it almost brought me to tears listening to all those names of those young men who died in the Civil War, because we forget all those. I mean, if it wasn't for them, the Union would not have stood. How many men died? And as a matter of fact, in every town in Maine, it's the same thing. They'll have plaques of all the men who served in the Civil and died in the Civil War. And up here, you can read the names. And so I think he was reading that right after the vacant chair, or during that piece in the thing. And with the names being read and the music in the background, I mean, it was really quite the moment.
The names that are still here in North Reading.
That's
Yes,
right.
that's
Yes,
right.
many of them, yeah,
You
families.
know the
Yeah.
families.
Maine, Massachusetts, and Pennsylvania had a very disproportionate
Number of casualties.
Casualties as opposed to other, for the north, as opposed to other states.
And one of the reasons for that, of course, is because at the beginning of the war, most of the volunteers were coming from those states that not only had the population, but they were very much so patriotic and also so anti-slavery, and they were abolitionists at heart, that they volunteered quite readily for the war. Yeah, good point. Yeah.
Thank you, Bob. We acted out a brief slideshow, and you can take a short nap if you want. I'm going to listen to music. So, let me tell you, in case you did not understand, most of these slides they were slides that Peter Haynes sent to us. And God bless Jenny, because she scanned them all, I can't do that. And she made these photos and then made the slideshow.
Can you shut off some of the lights?
Yeah, she's going to. I'd like to thank you for coming, but before I do that, could I please have some of the alumni here? Come up here, please. Come up here, please. Come up here, please.
You're welcome.
Come up here, please. Come up here, please.
Show them.
So these are some survivors, and please, if you would introduce yourselves.
I was Sheila Becky at the time, and Sheila Romo, but I'm Buffy Dysart at the time, and I was a member of the Treble Chorus.
Oh, one of the little kids. And I'm Beth Thompson, a soprano.
I'm Rick Isaacs, who's a bass, still a pretty bass person.
Susan Lyman had 3 children involved in it, one named Treble Chorus, one assistant treasurer, and then a fashion show. I was in a fashion show as a bride, the mother of the bride, and one of my daughters was a bride.
Mary Listino, the fourth wife of Bob Listino,
She's left.
always playing second fiddle to his bass. And I was an alto. My daughter was in the triple chorus. Lori, she's a big girl now. And so I got dragged to do this whole thing because I'm good at that.
Thank goodness that you were dragged.
Yeah. Now, after all those comments, I gotta bring the other show.
And I'm Nancy Ferretti, and I lead it also. So thank you all for coming. I appreciate it. Please enjoy the photos, yes.
And you also made this possible.
That's right.
Yeah, thank you